All right, welcome on to this Q&A. Again, want to welcome to this Q&A. So a question came in earlier. Question was why is there a difference between age of a girl and a boy that come of maturity, i.e. bar mitzvah by a girl? We say the age is 12 in a day, really. And by boys, 13, right? It's 13. That is the milestone, right? Is 13 in a day. So what's the difference, right? What seemingly is the difference? So we hold essentially that when we're talking about um, coming of age, usually that's when, and whatever, we'll keep this clean. Right, that is when people begin to physically mature and reach puberty. That's probably the main reason. Right, probably the main reason that the ages are considered those ages by a by boy when he reaches the age of 13. Right, a girl when they reach the age of 12, they are considered like they've hit puberty, right? So again, knowledge, a different issue also, but when they have specific knowledge or not doesn't really matter. But that's when they come of age. All right, they come of age, usually 12 or 13. That is the sign. They are called bar or bat mitzvah, right? Bar means either means son, literally. Bat means daughter of the commandment, or a man, woman obligated to do mitzvahs, right? Translate that way, translate the other way, etc. So some explain, like other halachic measurements in general, that this is what we call something imparted to Moses by God at Mount Sinai, what we call a halacha Moshe Sinai, right? A halacha given by God at Mount Sinai. Others say that's derived from the Torah's account of the destruction of the city of Shechem by Shimon and Levi because they want to retaliate for the rape of their sister Dinah. And each man took his sword, confidently attacked the city. And the term that's used for both is, meaning for both brothers, is ish, right? The word ish. Now, the younger Levi was 13, right? It is brought down that Levi was 13. So we derive from there, since Levi was known to be younger, that the age is 13, right? 13 for a boy. Now, a girl saying, also is going to, mature as well. She matures faster than a boy. So when she turns, practically speaking, when she's 12, she is obligated to mitzvahs. Now, even if they're not obligated to mitzvahs, parents have an obligation, 100%, 100% an obligation to teach them, right? Even before the age of bar mitzvah, right? Otherwise, how are they going to know how to do mitzvahs in general? So what happens is, they'll be obligated, right? They'll be obligated at a younger age because they mature quickly. That's a basic answer. Also, it can be learned out that from the creation of Eve, from the creation of woman. Why? Because the Torah says in Genesis, Genesis chapter 2, verse 22, it says, the Lord God built the sides, he had taken from man into a woman, and he brought it to man. That's what the verse says. Right? He took from his sides and created a woman. Now, there's another Gemara that says that they were really, they were back to back and God separated them. Right? So then you have an issue how you learn this verse if that is the case. But without going into that, it says, God built the sides. Right? Now, what is the word in Hebrew for building over here? It's vayiven. Right? Vayiven means to build in general. Now, what else does it mean or potentially mean? Right? Vayiven means to understand. Right? Havana, or say in yeshiva, you would say Havana. Right? A person has understanding. Now we're talking general understanding. We're not talking Kabbalistic and any, Kabbalah or anything else. They have understanding, right? Somebody, let's say knows how to learn. So it's brought down there, Mavin Dover Mitok Dover. They understand things between things. Meaning, if there's a contradiction, let's say between sources, they know how to answer, right? They know how to answer the contradiction. Yeah, very good. Right? They know how to answer. Okay, so Mavin, in general, means to understand. Yeah, so now what does that mean over here? What does it mean for us over here? So since it means he gave her understanding, not just the build, right? It could mean also he gave her understanding. Now, what does that mean? He gave her understanding. The God created a woman in such a way she has a mental maturity earlier than man. Yeah. And that would follow the opinion that, as we said before, they're created back to back, right? And the creation of a woman was accomplished by separating the halves, right? The Gemara in Eruvin, the Gemara in Brachos, whatever, in a few different places. So again, if you're going to say it means to build, kind of have a problem here, right? Kind of have a problem because building would seem superfluous. Yeah, in other words, if they were the same sides, or there were two sides of the same entity, there's no building, right? You wouldn't have to say building, right? So woman certainly wouldn't have required it, therefore also you could say it refers to wisdom. Or, there's another opinion, he was created either from Adam's tail or for an extra rib, let's say, the Medrash says. Even though they disagree on how she was created, the meaning of the verse exactly, they don't disagree the fact she matures quicker. Right? So again, one explanation, just whatever, it's an interesting explanation. That one explanation over here is that, he gave her understanding. Now, what does giving understanding mean? Simple explanation is that what? That God created a woman in such a way that she had a mental maturity earlier than a man. Now, we know that to be true, right? That we understand. Girls mature. It's a guy talking here, right? Girls mature faster than guys. That's just the way it is. Yeah, they will mature faster. So, like in the Orthodox world, getting married, let's say, so a woman can get married, let's say, by the age of 20, 21, 19, depends. If you're Hasidic, maybe 18, whatever. But a guy, even in Hasidic circles, maybe a guy would get married at 18. Could happen, right? But normally, what's the age? What would be the average age? Well, we've spoken about this before. What would be the average age for a guy today to get married in the Orthodox world? A guy would get married today in the Orthodox world, usually Usually 23, 22, 23, kind of rare if a guy and that they're not Hasidic, let's say, yeah, that they would get married at the age of, they start dating, let's say 21, 22, probably around 22, let's say, all things being equal, get married at 23, right? 23, 24. But a woman could be younger. A woman could be 20, 19, 20, something like that. Now, what's the difference? People can say, oh, come on, you're making all the generalizations and this and that, but it's true. Women mature faster than men, right? Maybe people are going to say today, well, it's not true. Things have changed. I don't know. People don't know what body they're supposed to be in, but that has nothing to do with maturity level. It has to do with other things, but not a maturity level. Right. So in general, that would be the case, right? That would be the case. They mature earlier. I don't think the establishment, whatever you want to call the establishment, is gonna disagree with that. Girls mature quicker. So this again is a halacha Moshe Sinai. This is the halacha that God passed down to Moses, passed it down to us. Because that's the age, right? Maturation for a boy is 13 and a day, for a girl is 12 and a day. Now, what are the ramifications? That's simple. That's a simple explanation. But what are the ramifications? The ramifications are that there's obligation for parents, right? Obviously, if they've grown up religious or they're going in this path, whatever, and the kids are younger, hopefully if they're older, it's harder. But if they're younger, there's an absolute obligation of the parents to educate their kids, no question. Right? And how to do mitzvahs. And if they don't know how to do it, they have to find someone to teach them. Right? But there's an obligation for a parent to educate children. Now, technically speaking, is a child obligated in keeping Torah? Technically speaking, no. They're obligated. Right? I say the Shema v'shinantam livanecha. You have to teach your children. Well, Torah obligation, seemingly. Okay. But for them to keep mitzvahs, is it an obligation? For them? No. It's a good thing. Right? It's a good thing to train them. Right? But not necessarily obligated. So you tell me, well, may not be true. Because parents have an obligation to obligate their child. If they see their child, let's say, a younger child, and they're eating something treif, you can stop them. You should stop them. Right? You don't have to say, okay, their kids, whatever, it doesn't affect them. No, you stop them. There's an obligation to educate them. Right? There's no question. But keep in mind, when they're underage, they're not liable. Right? Meaning, let's say you have a 7-year-old, can make a blessing, knows how to make blessings. Right? Let's say, if a 20-year-old who doesn't, 20-year-old Jew doesn't know how to make blessings. Right? So the 7-year-old, maybe you'll say, let him discharge the obligation from the 20-year-old. Yeah, in other words, he can make the blessing. He can have just, specific intention. Even though kids probably don't have specific intention. But let's say he understands the words. He can tell the 20-year-old, have in mind, right? Not going to go into how this works. You'll just take my word for it that it works, right? That have in mind, I'm going to fulfill your obligation. You have to hear every word and then say amen. Right? It's called fulfilling someone else's obligation. Obviously, they eat the same thing or they have the same obligation. A person can fulfill someone else's obligation. This, though, is a problem. Why? Because the 20-year-old, regardless of whether they know anything or they do not know anything, a 7-year-old can never fulfill their obligation. Why? A 10-year-old can never fulfill their obligation. A 12-year-old whose birthday is tomorrow cannot fulfill their obligation. Why not? What's the obvious reason? They haven't come of age. Yeah, they haven't matured. So a 7-year-old, even if he knows all the words, even if he knows all the words. And whatever level of attention, doesn't really matter. In general, he understands he's making a blessing. Let's make it easy. He understands he's making a blessing. But at the end of the day, what happens? He's underage. No, if he's underage, he cannot fulfill the obligation for someone else. If he's 13 in a day, he can fulfill anybody's obligation. A man, woman, child. He can fulfill their obligation. He can make Kiddush for everybody. He can make Havdalah for everybody. Whatever blessing it is, they can fulfill the obligation. But if they're underage and they know all the words, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Yeah. They will not be able to fill the obligation of someone older than them. Someone who's got an obligation, right? Let's say. This child doesn't have an obligation. What's the obligation? What's the obligation? Education. Okay. But the educational obligation does not allow them to fulfill the obligation of someone who's obligated because they're obligated, right? Because they have our age. Whether they're 13, whether they're 15, whether they're 75, doesn't matter. They are obligated Torah mitzvah if you're a Jew. So this 7-year-old or 10-year-old or 12-year-old, if it's a boy, right, cannot fulfill that obligation. They don't have an obligation in education. They don't have an obligation in actually be able to fulfill the mitzvah. Why? Because they're not of age. But you're educating them. There's an obligation to educate them. Yeah, and what if they don't want the education? What if they, go off the rails, they're not interested? Okay, so you can't force them. You do what you can, whatever, but you can't force them. It's a terrible thing. Watch child do whatever they're doing, and it goes against your grain and everything else. It's very hard to watch. Yeah, it's a very painful thing to watch. Right? And it's obvious why. Because you want that child to go in the same path. Whether they grew up religious, it came out later, which is going to be harder because of a child, let's say, is a teenager. Yeah, let's say you have a secular person, I know somebody, that they came to Judaism much later in life, and they had 2 daughters. They have 2 daughters, and these daughters were teenagers. They were teenagers at the time. They grew up secular. The parents are religious, right? They keep all the mitzvahs, whatever they have to keep, they keep. It's a hard thing to see. At Shabbos, they come in, they come out, they do this, they do that. They're still in your house. Okay, you can't throw them out. You're not going to throw them out, right? Unless, let's say you have other kids and they're having bad influence or whatever, then, it's a last resort. It's an absolute last resort, throw a child out because at least they're still in the house. But if they're having a bad influence on others, this is a serious question. Very, very serious question. But it can be hard to watch. And sometimes a parent, they don't have a choice. Right? And anybody in this process who wants to convert, in general, if they have kids, it's not a guarantee they'll convert. If they do, it's a bonus. Right? Or at least they become a Noahide or whatever. Okay. But, there's no guarantee. There's no guarantee they will convert. Especially if they're living at home. And if they are living at home, it makes it more problematic because they're not going in the same direction. Because there are many rabbinical courts will say that unless the child's out of the house, the parent cannot convert if they're not going in the same path. But you can't have non-Jews in the house. Even a parent will say, well, I'm in charge of the kitchen and they don't cook and they don't do these other things. You don't know what goes on. Right? And a rabbinical court doesn't want that responsibility. Plus, it's not, it's not healthy. In either case, it's not healthy. Right? Where you're going to have kids around, not doing what you want to do. Yeah. And it's painful. Yeah. It's not just painful, it brings up problems. Right? Kashrus being one of them. Well, that'd be a major problem. But it's also like, you're keeping Shabbos, you're keeping festivals and this and that, and they're running in and out and doing this and doing that. It's, that's why probably most rabbinical courts, if the child is not going to convert, then they will not convert the person unless the child is out of the house. Right? There are too many things that are problems. right? That are problems. Not every rabbinical court, but I think a lot would. I think a lot would make it much harder. If not, they just won't convert them because it just runs into other problems. Now, the question is, how far does this obligation of educating kids go? Right now, the Torah makes clear it's a Torah obligation. It's an absolute Torah obligation. No one disagrees. Right? The Torah says, by the Shema, right? Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Right? You say, if you have to ask Hashem Elokecha, right? You're going to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, right? Etc. With all your money, with all your might, etc. Etc. Then you get to the verse, V'shinantam Levanecha. You got an obligation to teach them. Right? With, Dibartibam. You have to speak of them, speak of the mitzvahs. When you lie down, when you rise up, that is the obligation to say the Shema when you wake up in the morning. And before you go to sleep, you say it at night. You say it at night as well. But it's an obligation, Torah obligation to educate kids. Now, there are mitzvahs in the Torah that I would say some are, I think, easier to do, in a certain way, and some anywhere in the middle, and some are extremely difficult. But the ones, in this case, some that are extremely difficult come up all the time, right? I'll give you two in the same category. One is educating kids, right? If you have kids to educate, right? That's not an easy mitzvah in any generation. Speak about that. And then the second one, what do I say in the same category? The second one is honoring parents. Honoring parents is also very hard. Also very, very hard. Right? Honor, respect. What do you do if they're evil? Okay, but it's a hard mitzvah. Rabbi Yochanan himself, one of the great rabbis of Talmud, Rabbi Yochanan himself, he didn't have parents. Why? Because his mother died in childbirth. His father died before he was born. But what did Rabbi Yochanan, great Rabbi Yochanan, what did he say? He said, I was blessed I didn't have parents. Forget about parents or evil. I'm not even talking about that. Normal case situation. A child, would want parents. You would think a child would want parents. All things being equal. Okay. But he himself said, I'm glad I never had parents. Maybe glad I never had parents. You can look up to them. You can idolize them. You could, get advice from them. They can help you in other ways, in many ways. Why would he say, I don't want parents? I'm glad I didn't have parents. Because he says it's the hardest mitzvah to do properly. He says, who's to say I'd be able to fulfill my obligation, of honoring my parents the way they should, right? The way I should. The Gemara Kedusha brings down a number of cases, a number of cases where honor is very hard. One of the rabbis, mother spat at him, through his purse or whatever, through his money in the river, etc. But, there are things you're not allowed to do. You can't answer back. You can't embarrass them in public. I mean, even if they're evil, seemingly, even if they're evil. Doesn't mean you can't defend yourself if they attack you. That's a different issue, right? But the Gemara gives a number of cases, very hard, very hard in such a situation. So they might say, well, in certain cases, maybe you're exempt. Maybe, right? Maybe that's the case, right? But you see from a case like that, where, his mother spat at her son or whatever, and, threw his purse in the river, right? Whatever the case is, still got to respect to a certain extent. Right? We're not saying the mother's evil, necessarily. You got to say, it's not a good thing she did, okay. The question is how far it goes. Right? How far it goes. Now, if they're evil, so it could be honor, you don't have to. Right? For sure, honor, you don't have to. Yeah, the question is how far respect goes. Now, can I speak Lashon Hara against them? No. It would be forbidden. The only case that would be permissible, the only case that would be permissible is if that person desecrates Shabbos in public. If they desecrated, if there is a, what do you call it? If we're talking about a case where the parent, let's say, desecrates Shabbos in public. Now, if a parent desecrates Shabbos in public, or any Jew for that matter, technically speaking, that parent or person, or it doesn't matter, whoever it is, they are going to have the status in that case of a non-Jew. Now, when they have the status of a non-Jew in that case, still can't lend them money, with interest, but if they touch your wine, which if it's not boiled, then you can't drink it if it's open, right? There are certain things that apply, even if they don't know anything. There are certain things that apply because they desecrate Shabbos in public that they would have the status of a non-Jew. Okay, now a person can say, let's say most people today have the status of Tinok Shanish, but someone who's considered like they've been captured by the non-Jews, right? Seemingly, they don't know nothing from nothing, right? Grew up as a potato farmer in Idaho, as Kaufman would say. No offense, anyone's a potato farmer grew up in Idaho, right? Regardless, they grew up not knowing anything. So certain things certain things they do, they're doing it because of desire, and God looks at it as if they did it by accident, not on purpose. But they do it on purpose, but they don't know anything. Yeah, it's not true blasphemy in that sense. It's desire. Why does secular Jews, eat, non-kosher food, Chinese food and shrimp and lobster and all these things? Desire. Not because they're going to say, I don't hold these kosher laws and I know all the Torah and I'm going against it. Doesn't mean that. They don't know anything. So they weren't, say they weren't brought up with it. They're not interested in learning about it, so that's it. So they won't keep it. Okay. That still doesn't mean they know anything, right? And it certainly doesn't mean, they know anything. So, okay. So certain things, they got cut a little bit of slack. Okay. Other things, not that way. Yeah, desecration Shabbos is one of them. Intermarriage is one of them, right? Definitely, you draw the line. You draw the line over here because you say, well, they don't know what they're doing anyway. Okay, but there's a line over here. Ask any Jew says, that is associated with the synagogue. If they're not associated with the synagogue, they're not going to care either way. But if they are associated with the synagogue, it may not matter. But if you were to ask them, according to the Bible, according to the Torah, what we call the Torah, the Old Testament, whatever you want to call it, the 5 books of Moses, we'll call them half a dozen different names. Whatever you want to call it, according to the Torah, is a Jew allowed to marry a non-Jew? Right? Yes or no? Now they'll say no, but no, I just said yes or no, right? There's no buts. All right, so the answer is no. They'll give you Webster's fifth definition why it's okay, or why it's not so bad, or doesn't matter, whatever. Okay. But it's forbidden. Right? That is a very fine line. I wouldn't even say, let's say better. It's not a fine line, it's outright forbidden. Nothing to talk about. It's forbidden. Maybe the person will convert. Maybe. Maybe you have to draw them close. They say, but we'll looking for converts. That's not the point. That's not the point. The point is the Torah says explicitly, it's forbidden. Number of places says it's absolutely forbidden. So you have to draw a line. You have to draw a line here, right? So if that's the case, you can't say ignorance is bliss. You can't say, because they don't know this and that. People know. Their heart knows what the truth is. Whether they go according to it or not, even if they're not educated, there are certain things they know. That, if you're associated with the synagogue, you should know. Right? Let's say. Not a guarantee, but, there are basic things. Laws of kashrus. Basic things. They'll say, we don't do it, or whatever, or they give you, Webster's 8th definition, right? But there are basic things they know. Kashrus might be one of them. The laws of the Sabbath, they might say, or Shabbos, they may say, it's for Orthodox Jews, not for us. Right? They'll give a reason why you don't have to keep it, or some maybe you haven't heard of it. Okay. This is something no one's going to say never heard of. No one's, if you're not associated with the synagogue, maybe a person will say it, right? But you say, according to Judaism, in general, should a Jew marry a non-Jew? Now, some people say it's discrimination. Okay? Yeah, maybe it is. So God discriminates against non-Jews. Okay? God discriminates against pig. God discriminates against, other things. Maybe. But fundamentally, think about it, right? Most people don't think so. This is a moot point. But you break it down. You break it down very simple. Is this good for Judaism or bad? Right? That is the question. Is it good or bad? Not for the non-Jew. Non-Jew didn't sin over here. Yeah, it's a Jew that sinned. Right? So I told someone, like someone told me, it's like, my wife's never going to convert. Okay, she doesn't have to. She's not the problem. You're the problem. Technically, through her, you had kids. Okay. Those kids aren't Jewish. Then, they don't want to hear that either. But my wife won't convert. So what? So she won't convert. Doesn't have to convert. Right? No obligation to convert. Okay. But runs into other problems. A lot of other problems. But that's a serious infraction to say there's no problem with it whatsoever. Okay, according to what source? And then someone will say, well, who says the Torah is true anyway? Torah's racist against this, racist against that, different things. Okay, so we may have an image problem. Okay, but it's written in black and white. It's written in black and white, you're not allowed to do it. Right? So some people are not going to care. And they're going to say that's discrimination. That's the stupidest thing I ever heard. This person is a fine person. Okay. And you, by saying that they're not Jewish and you think they're scum of the earth, I'm not saying they're scum of the earth. Not at all. They can be very fine people. I want them married into my family. No offense. Unless they convert. If they convert, they want to be proper Jews. Very good. And the Jew wants to be a proper Jew. Very good. Yeah. And if they don't have to. The Jew has to be. But the Jew's fault over here. 100%. 100%. Some people say that's racist. Okay. Torah might have an image problem. Okay. And even if it does, it's still forbidden. We hold it's forbidden. Yeah, every movement should hold it's forbidden, quote unquote. Yeah, but they'll say, okay, so let them convert. When have a bogus conversion, no one's going to accept. Okay, whatever. But they have to go through conversion. Good. Some say maybe they don't have to go through conversion, or they just keep the no-hide laws. It's not a problem. So whatever. A lot of issues here. A lot of issues here. So in the case of let's say siblings, or let's say better, what do we say 2 hardest mitzvahs are? Educating kids, very hard mitzvah. Very, very hard mitzvah to do today and any generation. Each generation has their, difficulties, whatever they may be. And honoring parents. Honoring parents also very hard. But a parent, to the best of their ability, has to educate their children. Right? Now, the question comes up, and comes up quite a bit, and that is a parent, or parents, let's say they want to, they're going to convert. Right? Or be no, it's even better. I think they don't convert. They don't want to convert. Or they can't convert, whatever the case is. They want to stay no, it's very good. It's a little bit harder, but they want their kids to go in that path. They want their kids to go in that path. Now, you don't want them to be idolaters, right? So if they're older, I'll bring up a number of scenarios, which not going to be good scenarios for most cases, but bring them up anyway. One case is you have somebody, the kids are older. Right? The kids are older. Now, the kids are older, it's harder to educate them. Yeah, because, like I say, they're set in their ways, but they've grown up a certain way. Once a person's grown up, again, it doesn't mean you can't teach them. And it doesn't mean they won't turn out the way you want, necessarily. Yeah, it depends. The problem is you got the power of the street. That's one thing. Power of a previous life, of what the life they've been living. But if they don't convert, which, again, they don't have to, then, if they're going to, the public school, they're going to feel really out of place. Yeah, they're going to feel extremely, extremely out of place. Someone asked, what's the definition of older? I would say 10 years old. Teenagers. I would say teenagers. Could be less than 10, okay. Yeah, it's definitely over 6 or 7, that's for sure. So you want to say 9? Okay. 9, 10? Yeah. Teenagers would be very hard to educate this way. Very, very hard. So even at a younger age, they're already established in what they do. Yeah. Established is a bad word, but they're already, they're already grown up a certain way. To change them at that age is not going to be easy. But it gets worse. Why? Because here, wherever they live, they're going to be, a handful of religions. These kids are. Again, I'm not going to say they're going to be, ultra religious. Some will be. Some, and if they are, why they send them to public school? But let's say they'll send, right, right. So let's say, what's the problem here? So either the kid wants to identify, let's say, as being Jewish, or he's going to identify as being Noahide. Now, they're going to identify as being Jewish, but they don't convert. It's a little bit strange, right? So they identify as a Noahide. But what's the problem? What's the hardship here? The hardship is, they're not Christian or anything else. They're not Muslim. Sorry, they're not Jewish. So they're no man's land, right? And there's no one around them. Probably, I know somebody like the closest person, a person's Noahide, the closest person to them is like 150 miles or more, right? So a lot of these things that Noahides do is online. Okay, yeah, so it's kind of a hardship. It's kind of a big hardship, right? There are a couple Noahide communities in the world, right? A couple in the States, one in South Africa, I think one in Canada, whatever it is. But I would think still hasn't been done. We haven't done it, but make more communities out there. Even though some people say you can't make Noahide communities, but it could, if it's done right, it could be done. They're not going to end up converting. Some might end up converting, but others won't. Yeah, it is a kind of a slippery slope. I would agree. It's not so simple, but I would say this runs into a big problem. Why does it run into a big problem? Identity. Identity for a child is a big thing. And again, it doesn't matter what level of religiosity they are, right? Doesn't matter. If they're more religious, they wouldn't go to public school, but it doesn't matter. even if they identify, right, as secular Jews. They identify as being Jews. Okay. Christian, whether they're not so religious, okay. Maybe go to church once in a while, this, that, but we'll say they're not so religious. They identify. They have an identity, right? Through religion, for better or for worse. They have an identity. Yeah. So a person wants to identify. Now the question over here is, if a person identifies, let's say, as being a Noahide, which again, I'm not saying, is a bad thing here. Right? Question is, if you don't have a community. First of all, people don't know what it is. Most people don't have a clue what it is. Like, what's a Noahide? Never heard of such a thing. Right? That's someone who wants to be Jewish. No. Right? It kind of throws people off. Well, if you're learning about, quote unquote, the Old Testament and different things, so why don't you convert? Why don't you become a Jew? Now, some people don't know you're able to convert. Right? In some ways, they're no man's land. So identity is hard. Identity would be very hard. I'm not saying a person should be an Noahide. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying there are issues, but they want to identify. That's the point. They want to identify with somebody, with some religion. So a kid will come and say, "Well, are we Christian? No, I don't go to church. Oh, so are we Jewish? No, because I'm not going through conversion. So what are we?" It's a hard thing trying, explain to younger kids. But the point in either case, that's going to make it harder. That's going to make it harder. There's going to be a lot of peer pressure. Definitely a lot of peer pressure, right? Who are their friends going to be? Who they're going to identify with? Very good. But even in the bigger scheme of things later, certainly not while they're younger, right? Or too young, let's say, who are they going to date? This is going to be an issue. This is going to be a real issue. And the reason is because most people, unless they find somebody like them, which could be almost like a needle in the haystack, but God can arrange anything, right? And God can do anything, so He can arrange it, right? But you're looking for somebody, it's not a Christian, not a Muslim, not any of these other whatever, other religions. They say they're neutral. They don't do they don't do anything. Okay, yeah. So looking for such a person, not so easy. Definitely not so easy. I'm not gonna say it's impossible, right? Definitely not impossible, but whatever, there are issues, right? Bottom line, there are going to be some issues. Now, that being said, the older the child is, the harder it is to teach them. Again, they don't have a peer group. Let's say you can't keep them locked up at home and everything's online. That's going to be hard. They're going to want to go out. They want to do things. They want to be with people, right? Mankind. For better or for worse, we are social creatures. We like to be out with other people sometimes. You like to do social things. The person's going to be cooped up. They got nothing. Right? You got no one to be with because everyone's so different. They're so different. Let's say better. They're so different. Could be everyone else is different also. But they're different for everybody else. Now, for a teenager, it's a big thing. It's not a small thing. Definitely not a small thing. One thing that saved me when I was in high school, I was involved in a Jewish youth group. Hung out with Jews. Yeah, by the time I became a senior in high school, half the people I couldn't stand anyway because of what people did, in general. But you want to be around people, even again, you're not getting philosophical and and religiosity and any of that. You want to be around people like you. That's what you want, most people. Yeah, you're gonna hang out with if a person's a Christian. I'm not gonna say hanging out with Jews per se. They're hanging out with their own. And their own social life. Somebody somewhere in Texas, I don't know, in the middle of nowhere, 30, population 3,200 became a Noahide. Very good. Everything in that place revolved around the church. So they had no social life, had nothing. They had zero. Kids were in public school. Yeah, I think eventually they moved. But at that time they couldn't move, but they weren't turning back. But you're in such a small place, okay. For whatever reason, you're in such a small place. At the end of the day, though, it's very lonely. It's really lonely. What do kids do? Right? Peer pressure is a real thing. You're the only one doing it against everyone else. That's very hard. Now, you can educate your kids. Listen, Chabad does this all over the world. It's them against the world. Okay. And they're looking for Jews to draw close. Okay. So they have to be a lot more insular. Okay. Yeah. And, so in a certain way, this is a similar thing because they're going to have to go to their own, they're at their own school. Maybe they have to be homeschooled. They're not going to necessarily send them to public school, but the problem is people around them and the environment around them. So what does Chabad do? Chabad has a huge network, unbelievably huge network. So if they're in the middle of nowhere and there are no schools, what do? They send their kids out. Send the kids out, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, because they got nowhere to educate them. They can't leave in that place. They can't live in that place, but they have a huge network. They got a lot of people have family. Baruch Hashem, they can send the family, to cousins, whatever. So they get educated in a normal place. Now, is that something that should be done? That's what they do. Right? That's what the Rabbi told them to do. Yeah, but it comes at a price. Definitely comes at a certain price. Okay. But you're sending them out because you can't leave them there. Because the environment is what it is. So they don't have schools. They don't. Let's say in a place they don't have established school. So they can't leave them there. So they have to send them out. You have to send them out. Maybe say once a year, twice a year. It depends where they are. But they're going to send them up to their own network. Okay. I mean, is that the ideal? I wouldn't say it's the ideal. Right? Then we wouldn't say it's the ideal. It's what people do. Right? Far from me, to go against the Lubavitcher Rebbe. I mean, be 10 times greater than I'll be in 100 lifetimes, right? But that's what he did. He sent people to far-flung places in the world, right? For better or for worse, in order to what? To reach out. The Jews don't know anything. Yeah, you got, Chabad in Thailand, you got them in Tibet, you got them all over the place. All over the world. In places seemingly like, however many Jews are there, right? But that's what they're there for. That's what they're there for. But, in some places, since there's no education there, even if they're starting slowly, some of their kids are older, they can't leave them there. You say, well, they're homeschooled. They get homeschooled to a point. Once they get older, it's harder. Much harder. Much harder. Someone asked, let me deal with this question. Someone asked, so an abducted son returned after 14 years. Impossible. I'm not going to say impossible. When you're dealing with teenagers and hormones and other things, it's going to be hard. I would tell you a 10-year-old is going to be hard. Or a 9-year-old is going to be hard. If they're much, much younger, it's much easier. Because you're starting almost from scratch. Right? When they're very young, very good. When they hit 9, 10, 11 years old, it's harder. I'm not going to say it's impossible. Nothing's impossible. Right? In general. I wouldn't say it's impossible. I would say, though, it's hard. Right? I'll give an example. When I was in Israel for 13 years, and I went back to the States, and in 2008, since the market crashed because of all these false loans that banks were giving for real estate, I was involved in real estate at the time, so someone told me, like, why don't you come back? If you can do it online, whatever. So, I live like everyone else in Israel. So I asked a lot of questions before I went. My oldest daughter at that time was 14, was going into high school, and there's a cutoff point, right? Usually, everyone will tell you, right, to bring kids to Israel, the age of 9 is the cutoff point. Now, does that mean you can't bring kids that are teenagers? The problem is, the older they are, first of all, they got a language barrier. That's one thing. Even though, in certain communities you can overcome that because there are schools for that. So that might be less of an issue. But there's one other major issue. The other major issue is fitting in. Fitting in. So in a certain community, they have a problem. They have a problem with kids going off. Yeah. And the main reason, and I saw it more than 20 years ago, and there are a lot more people have come since then, but the main reason is because the kids were too old when they brought them. Right? And, they brought all their American stuff with them, but that's part of the problem. I mean, it's most of the problem, but they didn't acclimate to Israeli society. Now, if you're going to come, you want to live in Israel, you got to be like the Israelis, right? Got to speak Hebrew properly, got to integrate. When they're coming in, as teenagers, or let's say better, over the age of 9, right? That's usually the limit. Because if they're older than that, it's much harder for them to integrate. Much, much harder. So I asked a lot of questions before I left, before I was even going to do it. My oldest daughter at that time was 14. She, and whatever, she still knew Hebrew. I was in Lakewood, so they were going to Torah schools, strong Torah schools, so that wasn't necessarily an issue. But, I had a 10-year-old, I had an 8-year-old at that time. So basically, since I went to a strong place, I was encouraged to come back. Now, my wife made a pilot trip to get my daughter into seminary, my oldest daughter into seminary. And we made the leap. We made the leap and came back. Now, I had a 10-year-old, 8-year-old, they didn't remember Hebrew so much. My 8-year-old was in first grade when I left. Right? I don't remember. I was in South America first, and I went to the States, so I was gone 3.5 years. I was gone basically 3.5 years. But my 8-year-old at that time was in first grade. So her Hebrew was minimal. My 10-year-old Hebrew wasn't much better. So at least the first a good part of the first year, they were exempt from a lot of tests, but they, they had tutors. They had tutors for a while to, get them up to par, so to speak. And whatever, I was on 2 continents in 3 years, not not very stable, so to speak. And whatever, it was a risk, right? It was definitely, risk. And for the most part, it was worth the risk. Yeah, my kids turned out all right, for the most part. But coming back that first year for them was very hard. It was very hard because they didn't understand a lot of things going on. Right? It took them a while to learn Hebrew. But, they met kids that spoke English and whatever, and it took them about a year. It took them about a year of, working with them and tutoring them, whatever. But, thank God it worked out. But they lived there before. So, it's not like we didn't know the environment. We don't know what the norms are, different things. Okay, so, we come as Americans, this and that, but, you want to fit in, you have to fit in. Right? So I didn't have a problem before that. So I certainly wasn't gonna have a problem. It's just certain things, my kids or whatever. So the general rule of thumb is after the age of 9, unless you've been here before, let's say, so then that might be a different issue. But if you've never been here, coming at that age, or coming older, what, there are you're gonna miss their friends in the States. Yeah. Especially if they're older. But that's one thing. But the second thing is it's a radically different culture. It's a radically different culture. All Jews and all religious Jews, some more religious, less religious, whatever it is. Yeah. But at the end of the day, it's a very, very different culture. Extremely different culture. Yeah. So it's a risk. But in this community, a lot of kids going off the rails. Main reason not necessarily integration's a part of it, but the main thing is they came too late. They came too late. And now the most important thing here is to integrate. Now, if a kid comes later, I think kids in yeshiva, right? Let's say. Now you got to find a place to learn. And it's not the same level, but much higher level here. Right, that's no question. But what if they went to a place where a little more open, so they had a lot more secular studies. Let's say maybe a lot more extracurricular things. They don't have that here. Right? Certainly in yeshivas they don't have that here. Right? There's one type of yeshiva that does. Yeah, but it has a name. In the Orthodox world, people poo-poo it because secular studies and other things and what they equate it with. Now in the States, after certain grades, right, usually like 9th, 10th grade, in a lot of places, they don't learn too much secular things. Some places have to, they don't have a choice. They make a whole joke out of it and whatever. They learn a little bit of science, a little bit of math, different things. So they're going to go on further to do things. They have to relearn everything anyway because they don't learn it. Right? I can tell you, you want to fit in, you want to go to a quote unquote a mainstream place, right? So going to a mainstream place means there's not going to be that much secular education after this, right? Certainly in yeshiva, girls' school is a different issue, but by yeshivas, not only that, you're not going to have too much, extracurricular things, right, to do because you're sitting learning all day. Like I got a 14-year-old going to be 15 this summer. And he's got a whole different schedule now. He leaves at 7 in the morning, 7:15, depends when he gets up, whatever. And he's got a break during the day from, I don't know, like 1:32 to, he's got about like an hour and a half, let's say. He goes back at 3 and he's home at 10. 10 to 10. Right, let's say. It's a long day. I got out in high school, 2:15. 2:15. Then, if you played sports or besides doing homework or whatever, extracurricular things, okay. Well, then you're done at 2:15. And within your schedule, you had gym and you had art and you had other things, whether you liked it or not, doesn't matter. Right? But some people say, like, it's too rigid. The system is too rigid. Yeah, but that you have to teach them, and there's a lot to learn, right? So you need all that time. What could a person been doing all that time? First of all, it takes time for their minds to develop. They've been learning Gemara for so many years. They have to be taught. It's a grind. They have to know how to analyze. They're being taught to analyze. And when you're younger, okay, well, the person's smarter or less smarter or whatever. It's hard, right? It's a hard thing. So, for most kids starting, just had a parent-teacher conference last week. I think my son's doing very well. They're, very happy with him, and he's very happy there. Thank God. Pray every day, 3 times a day. Certainly for success. But at the end of the day, it's every Rebbe that I spoke to, and certainly the head of the yeshiva as well. They're coming in. It's hard. First of all, they're learning to a different level than they're used to, and the day is longer. The day is longer. Last 2 years, my son finished at 6. Okay. 6 o'clock. Okay, you still have to, pray at night and whatever, but you have time. You have time to do things. You want to, the weather's okay. You want to play soccer, other things. Okay. Yeah. But if you get home at 10 to 10, it's hard, right? It's, they understand that. I mean, they're not machines. Certainly not machines. But at the same time, now some kids need an outlet. They need a friend of mine who was here for many years and went back, ended up going back to South Africa. But, two of his boys they didn't make it. They came much younger, so that was okay. But they needed outlets. Some kids need more outlets. That's, no one's a machine over here. And they just, it didn't go well for them. Right? And there are kids who grow up here, or if they grow up in very, very, religious places. And also it's hard for them. Right? It's hard for them. But, in the States and other places, it's easier. It's easier in the sense that many people work. The learning yeshiva, they'll, eventually, let's say, they get married, maybe they'll learn for a couple of years, maybe not, whatever, but eventually they're going to have to do something. Yeah. Here in Israel, there are a lot of people sit and learn. That's the ideal. Try and sit and learn, as long as possible. But, other people don't enjoy it. So eventually they're going to have to find something to do. Right? They're going to have to find something to do to make, to make money. But again, people may say, oh, because they work down upon, they're not learning full time, this, that. I think it's more of an issue here in some ways. I mean, in a number of ways, than other places. But I know someone's got 3 kids in America. Yeah, they grew up here, 3 kids in America. They fit in easier there. They have a smartphone. They do some other things not so, accepted here. They didn't. I know one for sure. One of the kids. I'm sure the other kids are not that much different. They didn't want to feel like an outcaster. They didn't want to feel like everyone's going to be breathing down their throat, et cetera. So for every little thing. So with certain communities in the States also, it will be like that. It's not going to be that much different, but it's a little bit. It's not Israel in that sense. But I know someone in South America, like this woman says, yeah, I know. When I come back to Israel, I can't have nail polish, right? There's certain things like you're gonna fit in. If you're not gonna fit in, try and buck the system. Depends where you want to do it, right? But anyway, my point was, before getting carried away with that, is that if a person comes later, right? They come with all kinds of baggage. Now, I'm not saying all of it's bad. Definitely not all of it bad, but if you want to fit in, there are certain things you can't do. There are just certain things you can't do. And if you come older and you don't know the culture, because even if you came to visit here, you don't know the culture, you don't know what goes on, and it's much, much harder to fit in. So because it's much harder to fit in, they'll feel like outcasts. Now, again, in certain communities, it's a little bit easier because they have schools that cater to this. Okay. But some of these people never end up, even if they grew up in this community, their Hebrew's bad because they speak English so much. Yeah, that's a different issue. But But you come past a certain age, it's very hard. Very, very hard for them to fit in. Not to mention the fact they probably miss their friends back home and different things, but the style is different. It's different. Israel's different than anywhere else, right? Even I lived in New Jersey, even like one of the strongest communities there. It's America. Yeah, again, obviously, they have certain rules and they have to be strict and a lot of different things, but it's a different ball game. It's a totally different ball game. So to integrate here is it's a whole different thing. But I would say that a child who's older, again, I am Mr. Doom and Gloom sometimes. I'm not gonna say it's impossible. It's hard. Once they're teenagers, it's very, very hard. Right? I'm not gonna say, I'm not gonna say impossible. So a person, and this is what a friend of mine did, that with their kids, they gave them all the love, all the support, whatever they wanted to do. They tried to help as much as possible, and they tried to be we call it dugmat ishit. They tried to be like an example for their kids. I don't know where their kids are holding today. It's many, many years ago, right? But they were teenagers at the time. They didn't want any part of it. They don't want to change their lives. The parents didn't force them. They say if you want to come, you want to come for a meal for Shabbos, you want, whatever they're doing, they're doing. Yeah, it's kind of hard to see it, in your house. But nonetheless, they did whatever they could to, try and draw them close. They don't force them in anything, to do anything. At the same time, they're just trying to make it a friendly environment, even though they're doing, what they're doing. But that's very hard. That's very hard. You're going to take someone who went, is going to public school, teenager, and everything that goes in with being a teenager, tell them, they have to do an about face and go against everything they've been taught and brought up. And, now all their friends and, they're going to want to go to a Jewish school and learn all this stuff. Then never. I shouldn't say never. Whatever. It's going to be a hard sale. Bottom line, it's going to be, a hard sale. They may see the beauty of it and say, wow, it's so interesting. Maybe they want to take classes. It depends. Some people don't want to have anything to do with it. They grew up a certain way. Once they have to change, they lose everything. They won't have the same friends. Who's to say they're going to make friends and whatever? There's a lot of pressure, right? A lot of pressure. So you want to pin me down? Is it going to be impossible to do? No. I'm not going to say it's going to be impossible. I'm going to say it's very, very hard. It's going to be very, very hard. I'll be a little bit optimistic, but they may not want to have anything to do with it. That's their choice, right? As a non-Jew, that's their choice. If they're Jewish, you got to be a lot more careful, right? In that sense, because you have an obligation trying to educate them. Now, trying to educate them, it causes a lot of friction. They don't want to hear it, right? After a certain age, they don't really want to hear too much from the parents. In general, some do, but others have no interest, what the parents have to say, right? So they just might not be interested, okay, right? But you have to be there for them, right? And sometimes, you have to see them do certain things that aren't good. You have to try and guide them, etc. But it will be hard. It will be a major. Major challenge. But at the end of the day, what they should see, if the parents have changed, they should see an absolute difference in them, how they act, how they dress, etc. Now, are they going to chalk it up to what the parents going through and how they, and it's going to be about religion? I don't know, maybe they'll see that, but that's not a bad thing. That's certainly not a bad thing. At the same time, though, they're going to come over to the other side. You got to give them space, and you got to give them time to process. Right? I know somebody. I don't know where they're holding today, but they kept jumping around like a beanbag. Like a Mexican jumping bean. Like be a Noahide, be a Christian, go back to Judaism, this, that. By the time the kids were old enough, they didn't want to hear anything about religion because everything was just like on the fly. When you're doing something on the fly and it's not concrete and it's not consistent, they don't want to hear it, right? They don't want to see inconsistency. They want to see important, they'll go along with it because they're younger or whatever. They don't have so much of a choice in certain ways. But at the end of the day, person's flying all over the place. They don't want to hear it. So that makes it harder also. It makes it harder also. What about a lot of energy to remember his mother? Okay, that's good. That 100% is good. That's positive. Tremendously positive. Yeah. You want to have as much of a connection if possible. Yeah. Now this, you're going to have to give it time and space. Yeah. If you can develop, a connection without anything else, if you can develop that connection and keep that connection going, very good. Right? Very good. Then gradually, you can bring certain things in. You can mention certain things. They may want to hear it. They may not want to hear it. They may be interested. They may not be interested. Okay. But first, you got to develop that connection. If you didn't have the connection before, it's going to be harder. But, a person already had a connection or they want a connection. Very good. Right? That's a very good start. Now, where it ends, I don't know. You have to see. But if that connection gets stronger, then at some point you can start mentioning about things you do. Right? And, then you see where it goes. They may be receptive. They may say, I don't want to hear it. Right? So, you got to be open, but you got to give them space. That's what I would say. Right? And also, let's say a kid grew up with religion, he goes off. He grew up, as an Orthodox Jew, and he went off for different reasons. Or she went off. You have to give them space. You have to be there for them, right, as well. And you have to make it as warm as possible. Like, an absolute last resort in this case is throwing the child out. That's the last resort unless they have an effect on others. If they have an effect on other kids, that's a problem. Person would have to ask Torah giant what to do. That's not so simple. Yeah, because they're causing other siblings to go in their path. Now, that you can't have. It's one thing that person went off and that person went sour. Okay. But to poison other kids while they're there, that's a harder thing. That you'd have to have, you have to have someone like really knows what they're doing. You have to have like a bona fide, Torah giant what to do in such, or someone like very, very big in Jewish education, like what to do. Because that's a problem, right? That is a very serious problem. But if that's not the issue, whatever they do in their room, they do. And, kids know, that their sibling is different and going through whatever, okay, as long as they're not having that, bad influence. If they're having a bad influence, okay, that's a much different, much different thing. Yeah, let me see. Listen, nothing, when it comes to, I will tell you, in 1900s, in the 20th century, what was the big thing? The big thing was the Enlightenment. The big thing was the Enlightenment, and a lot of Jewish kids went off because of secular education. They wanted secular education, and and that took like thousands. Forget about wars and pogroms and all that. That did its job also, right? But just what they say: curiosity killed the cat. So a person brings this stuff in, they start wanting to see quote unquote the outside world, and then they get tempted by it. The inclination goes crazy, right? And tens of thousands of children went off like lightning bolts. Now again, what happened in Jewish education, what happened in the yeshivas, what happened, other things going on that should have strengthened them. The inclination went rampant and took tens of thousands, right? Of kids out because, they got convinced it's a better lifestyle. They got convinced, you're not going to fry in hell forever, or, it doesn't matter, like be free, enjoy. Worship of the body, worship of the mind, these type of things, who said you can't read these secular things and cause havoc. 20th century, that's again, there were pogroms and all kinds of other things, but this was a serious issue. A very, very serious issue. You have socialism, you have communism, you have democracy, these things, Rebbe Chanan, Hashem Yikam Dama, God should avenge his blood, or Rebbe Chanan Wasserman, head of the Baranovich Yeshiva, Yeshiva in Baranovich, and the famous student of the Chofetz Chaim, right? And he writes in the Epics of the Messiah, a whole thing, a small book about, coming the Messiah. And one of the things, this is one of the things he writes about. Well, it's the devastation of these movements that took tens of thousands, of kids away, from Jerusalem, not because they put a gun to their head. That's also part of it, right? Going through pogroms, okay, but this they did to themselves, and they wanted to, quote unquote, they were convinced they wanted the freedom. They don't want to be told what to do every second of every day. They don't want to be told, work on themselves and sit and learn 20 hours. They didn't want it. They don't want it. It was too, it's too hard. It was, didn't make any sense anyway. And it's all theoretical, and come up with all kinds of excuses. Yeah, and a lot of them, went off the rails. Totally, totally went off the rails. And, that's what happened 20th century. Exactly what happened. Yeah, to a lot of people, a lot of kids went off because of all these different movements. So even because of persecution, tens of thousands of Jews left. They ended up in America. They got destroyed. There weren't any really, there weren't yeshivas there so much. Wasn't so much Judaism going on there, right, in general. And they just want to be like everybody else. They totally melted in. And look what happened. Generations later, the Torah's been built up. There's no question. Tremendous amount of Torah has been built up over the last 60, 70 years. Yeah, but you lost 90% of, 90% of the Jews there. Like, they don't know the Alpes. They don't know anything. They don't know anything. So, what are my thoughts about young adults? So again, it's very hard here because what do the girls' schools and yeshivas do? What's their ultimate goal? To turn the kid into a mensch. That's what the ultimate goal. Turn them into a proper, God-fearing Jew, but also, they have to be inspired. And sometimes the system doesn't do that. Sometimes the system, it's don't do this, don't do that. It's all about skirt length and arm length, and that has to be covered, and it turns people off. Some people love it, which is good. Some people love it, so they don't have issues. Other people, they struggle. So my oldest daughter opened up a seminary and has groups in different places, around Jerusalem for girls that are struggling for exactly this reason. Exactly this reason. They grew up religious. Yeah. They don't necessarily hate it. They don't hate it, but they need work on faith and belief in God and how it works. Right? Like learning Baruch Hashem. Not just, well, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do the other things. Right? So I say if you survive these schools and the kids come out intact, very good. Some kids love it, some kids are taken aback by it. They they want to understand why. They ask questions and they're not giving answers, and don't ask questions, what are you, a heretic? This and that. They have a legitimate question. But they're seeing that today. They're changing the way they educate in different ways. Because they understand these are legitimate questions. Absolutely legitimate. They're not asking to be a heretic. They're asking because they have a good question. They ask about, let's say about people suffering, right? Suffering we speak about a lot, right? That's not the topic here, but, they're asking, it's like, oh, what? You think God's evil? You think God's bad? Like, you don't want to get the class in a whole turmoil, and then, someone, sometimes you don't know where the question's coming from. Are they just asking to ask? Right? Or are they asking because they want to waste time? They want to waste time and get everyone involved in this whole discussion. So it depends. But if a person hears enough times, we'll discuss another time. Oh, come see me later. And they get blown off, kids are going to see, Torah doesn't have any answers. Yeah, so they're getting wise to this. They are understanding that when a person asks a question, they're not asking just, not asking, let's say to stall or to waste time. They have a legitimate question. I had somebody that a rabbi calls me out in his first position as a rabbi on his own, and somebody wanted to convert where he lives. And he said it's very strange. He said, this person was a woman, an older woman, and she was going through whatever, just becoming a doctor. I think he's becoming a doctor, whatever it was. And she was asking like a whole bunch of questions based on the book, based on the book Derech Hashem. Yeah, which we've spoken about a lot, many times. So he thought it was weird. Now he was more modern Orthodox, okay, but he thought it was weird. Was he asking about suffering or how angels work and these different things? He thought it was like strange. So he contacted me and he said, "What do you think?" I said, "These are legitimate questions. These are deep questions. Forget about Kabbalah. These are deep questions. There are people that are very deep. They want to know. To a certain extent, like these different things. What the world was like before Adam and Eve sinned, and afterwards, what was the difference? How does suffering work? How does angels, angels, and what's the purpose of non-Jew? Like all these different things." I said they're very interesting questions. So this guy was asking for, this rabbi was asking me for advice. So I told him. He thought it was strange. Like he thought it was strange. And here's something like, someone forget about Kabbalah. They just wanted to know, like, deeper things in the Torah. Very good. There's nothing wrong with that. We do that all the time. Or a lot of times. Okay. So he asked me my advice. He said, "What should I do? What should I do with this person?" They come ask me questions, this and that. So I told him, I said, "I'm going to give you free advice." I told him that I think it'd be a good idea for you to buy the book. Buy the book, Derech Hashem, and actually go through it. I said, go through it once, very quickly, just to, see what it says. And then sit on it. Sit on it and think about it. Think about some of the concepts that you probably already know about anyway. Right? Probably most of the things you probably heard about anyway. Or a lot of them. So I told him, buy the book. Not the person's a fruitcake. Yeah. And then it's like, oh, they're asking all these deep questions, and what's the matter with them? No, they want answers. They want answers. These are questions that people ask if they're thinking. In Emunah B'tachon, how does that work? How's faith and belief in God work? If God is all good, why is it suffering? They're good questions. They're legitimate questions. People want to know, about angels and demons and this and that. And sorcery, and is it real? And it's, how does it work? And reincarnate? These are good questions. These are very good questions because people get all kinds of messed up things that they read, things that they heard, things that they probably taught, all wrong. Yeah, all wrong. So now they want to get clarity. Now they're going according, they want to learn Jewish philosophy. Beautiful. Beautiful. Yeah, so I said, buy the book. I said, buy the book, go through it. I said, then you can answer. I said, because that's a game changer. I told them the book is a game changer. Changed my life many, many years ago. Many, many years ago. Gone through it a number of times. It's a basic book in Jewish philosophy. A lot of people don't learn it because it's very hard to go through. But, it's a basic book. So that was my advice. Told them to go buy it. So when I asked my grandmother lives in Englewood, New Jersey. Nice place to live. I think so. I think it's more modern. It's a more modern community. But I think there's a yeshiva there. I can check. But I think it's more of a modern place. But I can check that. It's a nice place to live. Sure, it's a nice place to live. Yeah, the question is who lives there. What type of Jews live there? I think there are other Orthodox Jews live there. But I think it's more of a modern place, right? Englewood, Teaneck. These type of places are more, are more modern, right? There are some, maybe other Orthodox elements there, but for the most part, it's more modern, right? It's a beautiful place with a lot of beautiful parks and other things there, right? In New Jersey, for whatever New Jersey is worth, right? But it's more modern. It's most likely more modern, right? So a nice place to live if a person wants to live in a modern community, right? I've spoken about that, a lot. I came from that, so. When I spoke about Jewish communities, right, and go on my YouTube channel, Beyond Orthodox Conversion Judaism, I spoke about Jewish communities. So I have what to say about the unorthodox community, which I've spoken about a lot. Right? Now you'd ask me, it's a nice community, yeah. Should you live there? Depends how you want to go. Right? I have my own axe to grind against modern Orthodox, even though they brought me closer to Judaism. I have a lot of gratitude, certainly, but a lot of things I see they do are off the rails. Some are, much more religious, some less, and some people doing crazy things. That go against Jewish law. How can they do that? Their minds are cracked. Not everybody. I'm not gonna say everybody. I won't throw everybody under the bus, but some people, like, their minds are just totally cracked. Why they cracked? Because it's a secular world. That's why they cracked. They give a lot more credence to the secular world than you should give. It's one issue, but watch my video over there. Any other questions? It's funny, every time, I speak about education or, like, Jewish education, it just reminds me of Pink Floyd. Yeah, we don't need no. We do. We need education. Definitely need education. Yeah, no question. We need proper education. Right? To synthesize both worlds is very hard. In the modern Orthodox community, they try and do it. Some places, they go to ball games. They don't think there's any problem going to a ball game. Football, basketball, baseball, whatever it is. Right? Watching movies as long as, it's relatively clean, which they aren't, but they'll also justify that. Right? So is that environment a person wants to live in? Yeah. For me, I would say no. Because I don't think it works. I don't think they produce what, they're not producing Torah scholars like in the ultra-Orthodox community. Right? And that's the reason. Right? Right? That is the reason. It doesn't work. I don't think it works. Yeah. And I've been through it, so I know. It's like, oh, he's got an axe to grind. Yeah, I do. I do. But what's the most important thing? Right? For an ultra-Orthodox Jew, the most important thing after they're married is sitting and learning as long as possible. In the modern Orthodox community, that's not the case. Right? Maybe you learn a couple of years, maybe. Right? Then you get a profession. Nothing wrong with having a profession. Okay. Got to provide for your family. Okay. Right? And, if you weren't educated in in university, which I've spoken about a lot of times, you can't feed your family. First of all, how to be a graphic artist. Can't feed your family being a graphic artist if you're good at it. Or digital marketing or other things. It's biggest one. It's one of the top 5 biggest lies out there, right? You need a secular education, get a job. Not true. Not true. They'll convince you, but it's not true. 100% not true. Anything else? How's a woman prepared to be a wife to a Torah scholar? What are the keys? Keys are that, you have to respect the person, what they're doing, right? That's for sure. Right, that's for sure. And you have to be growing as well. Now, obviously, women's not learning, full time and, all that, you have to be Nezer Kenegdo, right? What's a Nezer Kenegdo? Someone to help opposite mate. Doesn't mean whatever they say you do, right? But, you have to say in many things as well. But again, how's the person prepare for that? Again, it's a lot in Emunah Bitachon, faith and belief in God. It's about how you want to look and what you want, right? Working on character traits, etc. You try and be the best person, spiritually, but, at the same time, I would say very simply, you got to buy into the system. Like, if they're going to learn, whatever, although they have to, that spend time, other things, but if that's the most, important thing to a person, then they should merit it, right? They should merit it. How exactly do you merit it? A lot of prayer, right? A lot of preparation. It takes preparation. Doesn't mean, you can't try and find someone, at the same time as you're preparing, but, you can, you learn, you work on, character development. So someone got remarried, whatever, true rabbinic scholar I've known for many, many years. And I don't know anything about this woman, but, like, this guy's, like, learns around the clock and he's doing a lot of good things. Okay, you got to make time, whatever. And she has to realize what she's in for, right? You married Torah scholar, you're married to the Torah. It doesn't mean it's going to be gone, all day and all night and, she never sees him, but she has to realize that, it's a lot of self-sacrifice, right? And it can't be a person going to say, I'm willing to sacrifice. Not question sacrifice, right? Sacrifice is the wrong word. Right? Yeah, you believe that's what you want. I know someone got divorced after many years, married someone, sat and learned, was very happy that whatever, the person died. But this person was a convert for many years, many, many years. So, it's something you have to want, but you have to know what you're in for, right? That's the best preparation. You have to really know what you're in for. Hours per week, Jewish married man study when he has a family, probably a couple hours a night, maybe an hour a night, 45 minutes, or let's say 45 minutes in the morning, or an hour in the morning, or an hour in the afternoon, most likely at night. Maybe he learns before he prays or after he prays, and then maybe he'll learn an hour or two during the day, maybe. So if you want to say 5 days a week, maybe 10 hours a week. Maybe 10 hours a week. Shabbos probably more, right? Maybe he'll sleep more, but right, Shabbos should learn more. So that would be, I would say, the minimum, probably an hour, at least an hour. At least an hour a day. Right? But someone wants a real bona fide Torah scholar, they're going to be learning a lot more than that. A lot more than that. Anyway, I'm going to stop here. I just every Tuesday and Thursday. 10 o'clock Eastern Time, 5 o'clock Israel Time. Anyone has any questions, feel free. Find me on Facebook at Michael Kaufman, Beyond Orthodox Conversion Judaism, OrthodoxConversion.com, Beyond Orthodox Conversion Judaism on YouTube. There I got videos, Q&As, ethics of our fathers, book of Leviticus. You want to send me an email, RabbiChaimKaufman@gmail.com, RBBI, CHAIM, COFFMAN.